Uh, we are continuing this series of videos on political philosophy. And today we're going to be looking at a famous and classic piece, which is Of the Social Contract by this guy right here, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Uh, in some ways, we'll see Rousseau offering something novel, and in many ways, we'll see Rousseau echoing or giving parallel arguments to some of the other things that we've seen both behind Rousseau, like Hobbes, and also ahead of Rousseau, like in Anderson. So, uh, here's the plan for today. We're going to be looking at an excerpt from Of the Social Contract out of this textbook edited by Stephen Kahn. But I've also numbered paragraphs for each book. So if you have a different edition, you can follow along that way. But here's the plan. We want to look at a challenge, a question, which is about how we can find alignment between justice and utility. We'll then talk about the social pact, or as it's also sometimes referred, the social contract. And to that end, we will also see Rousseau developing what we call a theory of the general will. And he'll offer some suggestions on the limits of sovereign power, which will be established through our understanding of the general will. So, without further ado, let's think about this challenge, this puzzle about how justice relates to utility. And at an intuitive level, we may see many situations where justice and utility are in conflict, right? We could imagine a situation, for instance, where an angry mob might want to put to death somebody that they believe to be guilty of a crime, but we might think that that would be wrong if this person is actually innocent, right? So justice would be letting the man go free. Utility would tell us to, give the mob what they want, right? We could also think of other situations. For instance, we might, for instance, uh, give less priority to some people when it comes to rationing medical resources during a pandemic, right? Would we send away elderly people because we think that they have a worse prognosis and we could save more lives using the ventilators elsewhere? Well, utility might say that, but many people will also say that it's an injustice to abandon certain members of society. Uh, so we could come up with examples all day that might involve these cases where doing the thing that makes everybody on the whole better off might involve treating some unfairly, abandoning some, or maybe even violating the rights of some. So we can think of this, generally speaking, as placement of unequal burdens or unfair burdens on some in order to maximize benefits for others. Now, here's the kicker. Even though we see this intuitive conflict between justice and utility, Rousseau is going to tell us that under a well-functioning state, uh, our social contract, our laws, will make things such that what is good for all of us will also be just. It will also be legitimate, and in this way, we might harmonize our aim for what is good for everybody with our desire for justice. And it has been said that understanding this alignment, understanding how justice and utility are actually friends rather than enemies, is one of Rousseau's main tasks that he set out for himself in Of the Social Contract. In fact, we see this question about justice and utility like book one, chapter one, paragraph one, right? This is the starting challenge. So, how is Rousseau going to address this? Well, he's going to give us a theory of how a legitimate sovereign emerges. Now, there may be illegitimate rulers, but he wants to think about how a state emerges and functions in the right way. And one thing that he's going to say is that legitimacy doesn't come from nature. So it's not as if by natural capabilities or by gifts from God does a person get to be a rightful king, let's say. He's also going to say that your power doesn't legitimately come from force, right? So there's a famous saying, usually disagreed with among philosophers, that says, might makes right. Uh, that the person who is entitled to do what they do is entitled to do so because they have the power to force others to comply. Rousseau says, for one thing, uh, if you have this force that's able to make others comply, then the question of legitimacy doesn't really enter into the conversation because they're just going to make you do something by force. So it's not a very good explanation of legitimacy. The further problem is that on this picture, the person with the right to rule might always be changing. Just like uh, the person holding the title of heavyweight boxing champion is always changing year over year. Uh, well, on this might makes right theory, it seems like maybe the people who deserve to be in charge would also change year over year, like the heavyweight boxing champion. That's not what we're looking for when we are looking for a theory of what is establishing a lasting and stable sovereign. So on this point, he says, if it's not from nature and if it's not from force, then convention, we might say a mutual agreement and plan for action that people come up with together, that's going to be the only other possible explanation that Rousseau leaves for us. Now, maybe you can come up with a fourth explanation that's distinct from nature, force, and convention, but Rousseau doesn't see it. If it's not from nature, and if it's not from force, it's going to be a plan for acting that people figure out together. So that's the first suggestion. The sovereign needs to come about through a convention. He says the first convention isn't even really a legal compact, right? He says before people give themselves to a king, they have to first be a people to begin with. And you might realize that this is a nice contrast with what Hobbes was telling us. Hobbes says that you can't have a group, you can't have a people before they've made a contract with the king. And this is part of Hobbes's argument that there is no covenant between the citizens and the sovereign themselves. Now, Rousseau is going to put it differently. He's going to say that there, prior to any legal arrangements, can be groups of people who have a common place, common concerns, and common interests. And in this way, the notion of being a people is prior to any legal arrangements. And in this way, Rousseau is going to say, this is what we might call the first convention, that we live together and cooperate together in a natural, what we might say, not quite natural, because remember, it's not purely from nature, but we have this ability to pre-legally come up with conventions of living together. You might think of how a family is a group of people with common interests and common values before and separate from the law. But we might also have a family of compatriots that we're living near and together with. But after this first convention of living together and being a people, we can then make a further, what Rousseau calls a social pact, or what is sometimes referred to as the social contract. So he's going to say that in this pre-legal state of nature, we already have many capabilities, but we can unite, we can give up certain capabilities and forces that we already have. And through this, the way that Rousseau thinks about it, we are, by associating, protecting your person and your goods of every person who's entering into the contract. So you give up certain abilities that you had in the state of nature in order to protect yourself and also the resources and the goods that you are trying to maintain stable possession over. And under this contract, and this is parallel with what Hobbes says, we want to enter into the contract as a group of equals. So nobody has more claim to any other particular rights than any other person has. And under this picture for Rousseau, it's more socially minded than Hobbes, where they're both saying that we're going to be overall better off living with a state and living under a contractual relationship. The way that Rousseau thinks about it is that we're putting in common his person and whole power under the supreme direction of a general will, and in return, we receive in everybody a member as an indivisible part of the whole. Now, this picture gives us more of a sense that we are in things together as a team when we sign a social compact together. Whereas Hobbes's idea is more like we as individuals are protecting ourselves from one another. And the way that Hobbes thinks about it is that we are giving up freedom for the sake of advancing security. It's a little different for Rousseau. He's actually going to say that there are different flavors of freedom. You might actually notice that this notion of like different kinds of freedom harkens back to last week's discussion of Elizabeth Anderson, where she talked about positive, negative, and Republican liberty. Well, Rousseau is sort of anticipating that line of thought. He's going to say that there's this thing called natural liberty, and natural liberty will be sort of the kind of freedom that Hobbes was interested in, that you can do whatever you feel like doing. And this is maximal within the state of nature, this situation where there is no government whatsoever. But Rousseau, unlike Hobbes, doesn't think that that's all there is to liberty. There's also civil liberty. So you have ownership of all you possess. So you could think about this as ownership over things that you own, like this water cup that I have sitting near my feet. To possess it is to have sole control over it, and to have the expectation that if somebody were to try to steal it from me, I would have certain legal recourse. You could also talk about ownership of yourself and the ability to exercise certain human rights, like speech. So we gain civil liberty by entering into the social contract. So we can think of entering into the social contract as an opportunity to gain not just security or protection from a violent death, like Hobbes is thinking about it, but you actually become more free when you are given the protections of the state. Rousseau further suggests that we also have the notion of moral freedom. So you are free when you are acting on conscience and on the basis of principle. So Rousseau is going to tell us that you are morally free when you are obeying the laws that you prescribe to yourself, because nobody else is dictating to you. Now, remember that Anderson's third kind of freedom was Republican freedom, the freedom not to be under the arbitrary authority of someone else. Well, we might think of moral freedom as controlling yourself. So in that way, it's almost like Republican liberty. But I think that we can see it as a separate notion. The idea of moral freedom is that you are more free when you are acting on principle and giving the rules to yourself rather than acting on impulse like you do in a state of natural liberty. So in this way, Rousseau thinks that in a state where we have more civil liberty, where we can educate ourselves, where we can become more morally virtuous, we become more free again when we enter into the social contract. Now, key to this idea of the social contract is that each person in the social contract puts themselves under the direction of what Rousseau calls the general will. Uh, Now, the general will is a slippery concept, but it's also a key concept for making sense of the work of the social contract. And one of the reasons why it's a challenging and arguably exciting text is because uh, part of the work for the reader is to really get a grip on what we're talking about when we talk about the general will. Uh, First suggestion, and I think that this can be a helpful guidepost, when Rousseau was talking about the general will, he's not just saying it's the will of all. So it's not just the sum total of what I want, what you want, and what all of our other fellow countrymen want. Uh, Rather than being the will of all, we're going to say that the general will is something separable or distinct from what everybody wants. Now, he does say that in order to express the general will well, uh, citizens will speak their own opinions. So they will talk about, say, what a law might do in order to affect them and why they care that it is or isn't passed, right? He also suggests that factions, and one thing that we might think of as a faction is a political party with an agenda that also gives a large number of people talking points about how to think and navigate an issue. So the more factionalism uh, we have within a society, and we might even say the more indirect our democracy comes, the less clearly our law and our state will follow the general will. Given that we have a moment of very partisan and factional politics here in America today, we might think that maybe this notion of factions, rather than each individual citizen speaking for themselves, could diagnose something about why things are difficult in our current political moment. Okay, so it's not just the will of all, and it's not just what our factions are telling us. He says the engagements which bind us to the social body are obligatory. So you have to obey the general will because they are mutual. So these are rules that we are all in together. And the nature of our political obligations is such that in fulfilling them, one cannot work for others without working for oneself. So this is nice. So it's not just what you want personally, but it's what you understand to be valuable for both yourself and the rest of the citizens engaged in the social compact with you. So, as he puts it, when we think about will and when it can count as general, he says it's not so much the number of voices as maybe the common interest that unites them, right? So, in this way, we want to think about what is shared in the will of me and you, right? And once we can figure out what our mutual interests are, then we can recognize those specialized and generalized interests to be part of the common general will. Now, here's an interesting, and we might even say paradoxical passage. Some people might find this passage a reason to dislike Rousseau. But he says, if you refuse to obey the general will, you shall be constrained to obey it anyways by the whole body, that is, the sovereign, society, what we have agreed to as a group. And in this way, he says, which means nothing else, that the person forced to obey the general will shall be forced to be free. Now, you might think that this just doesn't make any sense, that if you're forced to be free, that's paradoxical. That's kind of like sitting up and sitting standing up and sitting down at the same time. Or it's like being black all over and white all over at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense to be forced to be free. Now, maybe one helpful line of thought is that by giving up a certain amount of natural liberty, we might also think of that as negative freedom, you'll gain certain positive freedoms in that you will be advancing the common good by being made to fall into line with the general will. This is a difficult interpretive question, right? And as I mentioned, the general will is somewhat of a slippery concept. Just to give you a feel for the difficulty of this concept for Rousseau, we can go to a wonderful resource. Anybody serious about philosophy should read it plenty, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and we have an article by Christopher Bertram on Rousseau on the SEP. And Bertram points out there are at least 3 contemporary understandings of the general will, right? One understanding is what we might call a democratic understanding. So what's different between the will of each and the general will is that the general will is what we have arrived together in their assembly. So we might think of the general will as the procedural result of doing democracy together. And then the thought is, when we constrain somebody to follow the general will, what we are doing is we are making sure that they come into line with what they have tacitly consented to in being a member of the democracy, and whatever the democracy says goes. Hobbes had a similar line about this as well, that even if your favored sovereign doesn't get the crown, you still have to get in line with whichever sovereign we agreed to. Otherwise, you're just thrown back into the state of nature. So that's one understanding. There's another understanding called the transcendental understanding. So we've got all the individual wills, as I'm representing each individual will with each wiggling finger here, and then we abstract, right? So there's a transcendent incarnation of what is common between these citizens, and we have an abstracted transcendent, which just sort of means a separate will over and above all the particular wills, right? So it's an abstract incarnation of the citizens' common interests. And the third one is that rather than thinking of it as an abstraction, the general will is made out of actual willing, but it's only part of what you're actually willing. It's only what you're actually willing toward the common good. Now, you could use any of these understandings, maybe work your way through understanding whether Rousseau can justifiably say that a person can be forced to be free. And moreover, whether this more precise understanding of the general will can help us to understand what we're aiming at when we enter into the social contract. Now, once we get this picture of the general will, another useful thing about it is it can give us a story about what the government can and cannot do. We'll remember that Hobbes told us that the government, given that it has the right to all things and hasn't entered into any covenants itself, the sovereign has unlimited power. But this Hobbesian unlimited power view is not Rousseau's. In fact, Rousseau will say things like, look, slavery cannot be justifiable under the social contract because slavery just goes against the general will, right? That it would have such a disregard for the common good if we were to put one individual into subjugation, right? And to this extent, if a state stops pursuing the end that it was instituted for, which is the general will, the common good, Rousseau tells us that every man can fully dispose what is left to him of his goods and liberty by convention, so that the sovereign never has a right to burden one subject more than another. So given that we all enter into the social contract as equals, we can't have inequity within the actual dealings of the sovereign. And Rousseau will also tell us that laws created by the general will concern no particular object. Now, what he means by this is that what is ordered even by the sovereign regarding a particular subject is not a law but a decree, not an act of sovereignty but of magistracy. I therefore call every state ruled by laws a republic. And when we talk about a republic in this context, we might think of it as a state that follows rule of law rather than arbitrary authority, right? And in this way, we might say that our laws in a republic are general and consistent, and we apply them in a way that says, look, anybody who jaywalks may be given a fine. But it's not going to be saying something like, well, when Robert jaywalks, we will go after Robert. Right? If we think about a contemporary example, we might think about a law that's designed just to shut down TikTok, right? A law that says TikTok will be shut down. Rousseau's going to say that's not really a law. That's a decree about one particular app or website that's being shut down, rather than saying, websites that are owned by such and such entities and which handle certain kinds of data will not be allowed to function in the US. Now, a law like that would not be just a decree, but given its general nature, would be more of a law, right? As he puts it, for then, only the public interest governs, and the public entity is real. So we're saying that by having a general nature and having a general applicability, rather than just singling out particular targets, we are focusing on the public interest rather than the whims of a particular individual making decrees. And in this way, Rousseau will say every legitimate government will be republican. Now, what he's saying here is that every legitimate government will be accountable, and it will be non-arbitrary in the way that it functions. Now, to put it this way, when we have republican government, we are made more free because we have more protection for the general will, which is going to advance our civil liberty and our moral liberty. And he's also going to notice that under a republican government, we are all treated as equals under the law. Now, this point about equality is appealing in itself. It will also begin to move us towards the second part of this course, which will examine questions about what we're really looking for when we aim at equality, and why some philosophers find equality to be such a valuable thing. And in this way, we can see this concern about liberty and equality and these special human rights making not just a state, but a good state, a well-functioning state, or that just state that is carrying out its laws in a way that's legitimate, but also in a way that is good, preferable, and what we might call just. So that's where we're going to go in the second part of the course. We're going to be transitioning away from this question of why the state should exist at all, more towards the question of, well, what features should we be looking for in a well-functioning state? So just to sum up, for Rousseau, justice and utility ultimately should be aligned in that well-functioning state. And that's because the laws are the creation of those who are governed. And by coming together and making a social contract, what we are trying to do is follow the general will. And laws according to the general will be obligatory for us because we signed up for them ourselves. But these laws will also be in the common good. So I hope that brings a little clarity, but also some exciting philosophical questions to you about Rousseau. We'll wrap things up for there. Thanks for listening, and please take care. Cheers.